right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Riley Pfaff. I'm another member of our Embark student team. And we're really glad you're here for our third and final panel today, which is getting started in human rights, international development, and social policy. We're really pleased to have Julie Snyder here today. She's a Master's of Public Policy candidate, and she's going to serve as our moderator for our panel today. So with that, I'm going to let Julie introduce our panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Riley. And it's so nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd, too. So I'm so lucky to be joined here today by our esteemed panelists. We've got quite a varied background. I do have to say, unfortunately, one of our panelists, Derek Rhodes, who's currently working with Miami Heat Community Engagement, he unfortunately had some travel issues, and so he's currently on his way back to Miami, and he's so sorry to miss this. I know some of you are interested in speaking with him, so if you'd like to get connected, he said he'd be happy to talk with anyone through connections with Suzanne or Elise, so please keep that in mind. But we are joined by three fabulous panelists this evening, starting off with Mintu Pham, who's currently at the UN Foundation. We have Kiara Coughlin, who's at USAID, and we have Tomas Lopez, who's currently with the Southern Poverty Law Center.
I'm the executive director of Democracy North Carolina.
Excuse me. Sorry. Goodness, he's got such a storied background, y'all. Oh, it's hard to pick which affiliation. So I would love to have each of you, if we can just go down the line, if you can spend about a minute or so just kind of retracing how you got to where you are in your career.
Oh, goodness. Only in a minute. Okay. I think I might be the oldest person on this panel, so I will still try to keep that under a minute. So I graduated from Duke in history in 1998. Don't do the math. But I also took a lot of classes in the policy school. And I did a lot of work in the Heart Leadership Program. So if any of you are interested in doing, in this topic, international development, human rights, social policy, doing good in the world, definitely look into the Heart Leadership Program. But the Heart Leadership Program then took me to Ethiopia. I did a fellowship there for a year with Save the Children and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, working with refugees in the field for about a year. And then I moved to Washington to work on refugee policy with the Women's Commission for Refugees, doing advocacy on the Hill and that sort of thing. And then I went to graduate school. I went to the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton to get a degree in international affairs and public policy, focusing on international relations. And while I was there, I traveled to the former Yugoslavia to work on the peace agreement, implementing the peace agreement to try to get the country back on its feet again. After that, I finished graduate school, and I looked around and I said, well, I've always been pretty critical of the United Nations. I might as well just try to figure out how this place works. So I, through an alumni network, got in touch with some people there. And to make a very long story short, got to work for Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, in strategic planning. And this was back in 2005, just after the Iraq War, which I'm not even sure some of you may have been conscious of what was going on in the world at the point. But in any case, it was a big sort of crisis for the international community about why we go into war, what we're trying to defend, and whether international institutions are set up to help us succeed in those types of places and making those types of decisions. So I tried to help defend the UN, and part and parcel of that was to figure out how we reform the UN and make it work better and really achieve the ideals that it's out there to do. And so that was sort of crisis by fire, really sort of crisis communications, learning top to bottom what the institution was like, and being the youngest person in the office and the youngest woman in the office trying to do this at a professional capacity, which meant really working with the diplomats around the world and understanding just really core to how the UN works, how you bring governments with very disparate views and philosophies and political opinions and all of that together to achieve something. I was there for a while, and then I worked in philanthropy. I came to the UN Foundation about a decade ago to work on this type of these issues outside. And I then helped to create the set of Sustainable Development Goals, which, has any of you heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? This is great. So this is what I've spent the last 8 years of my life on, how we end extreme poverty, deal with climate change, and deal with global inequality. And so really trying to help the ambassadors negotiate that. I'm happy to talk through a little later about how one gets to that career. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. So I'm listed on the sheet, I think, from the State Department. I'm actually with USAID, and I have a shorter history than Mintu, but I graduated from a different university with international relations and had no idea how to get into international relations, so I bumped around a little bit after graduation, and I ended up working for a small software startup for a while. And then I ended up getting back into international relations and was at the State Department for a while with the Office of Science and Technology Cooperation. And then they encouraged me to join the Peace Corps, which I did, and kind of got to see international development. And I was working in Cameroon as a computer science teacher. And after that, the Peace Corps kind of brought me to Duke, where I got my MPP and concentrated in international development. And then I got a job with USAID, working in their global development lab, so continuing working on science and technology and innovation programming, where I'm still kicking it there. Yeah.
Great.
All right. Again, my name is Tomas Lopez. I was born and raised in the Bronx, New York. If there are any New Yorkers in the room, yes, thank you. I graduated from Duke in 2006. I was, like Mintu, I was a history major, also involved in the Heart Leadership Program, would second all those recommendations. When I was in college, I was really interested in social movements and how movements work, how they happen, how change happens. And a lot of my academic work, both in the public policy school and as a history major, touched on that. I went to law school at Yale and graduated in 2010, which don't do that math either. But after that, I ended up working out in Arizona after I graduated. I worked as an immigrants' rights lawyer first with a professor at the University of Arizona Law School who ran an immigration law clinic. This was right after Arizona had passed their big anti-immigrant law, their Show Me Your Papers law, SB 1070. And it was off of work that I did there that I spent 2 years in Alabama at the Southern Poverty Law Center from 2011 to 13. And it was there that I was a sort of baby lawyer working with much more experienced people that were suing the state of Alabama over this comprehensive anti-immigration law. That experience taught me a lot about what it means to sort of interact with real people, sort of in service work, in big picture work, and how to hold in balance really big ideas and what they actually mean to people's lives. Off of that, I worked for 4 years in New York at the Brennan Center for Justice, which is a kind of law and policy institute that works to improve the nation's systems of democracy and justice. And I was a voting rights attorney there. Worked in different parts of the country on both litigation against bad voting laws and advocacy work at the state and federal levels on trying to make good laws happen. I did that work until 2017, at the end of 2017, and for the last just under 2 years, I've been executive director of Democracy North Carolina, which is a statewide nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based here in Durham that has been around for nearly 30 years. And what we try to do is make sure that every North Carolinian has access to the ballot and that they can use it. And so we do that through advocacy, through subject matter research and grassroots organizing. And so it's very different from being a lawyer, but it's been a lot of fun, and I'm really delighted to be back on campus and also to sort of have free food like a Duke student again.
Well, thank you all for that really interesting retracing of your careers. And I'd love to have Mintu kick us off and think about if you were able to travel back in time and go to your undergrad self, what advice would you give yourself?
Such a good question for me, because earlier today I went to talk to some students at the School of the Environment, and it was in Gross Hall, which I think is anyway that way. And I walked by my very first class at Duke, which was chemistry, with Dr. Bonk, if that ages some of us in here. But in any case, that was my first class. I ended up not doing any more chemistry after that, as you can probably imagine, having heard my career. Advice as an undergrad. So take classes in things that you love. After just hearing Thomas's bio, I think we probably had a similar history mentor in social movements. But, take classes that you really love. I know a lot of parents get very nervous about, I remember telling my mom I was going to be a history major, and she thought, this is crazy. What are you doing? Why can't you just be a lawyer or a doctor and go forth? But I think, just being armed with a broad range of ideas and just being able to think and analyze and write. So any courses you can take to learn how to express yourself clearly, and not with big words and not with long sentences, but very clearly. Clear writing reflects clear thinking, and clear thinking is what hopefully you learn when you're at Duke. So definitely take as much of that as you possibly can, and do it in different ways. So there's literature classes. I remember taking some literature classes that really inspired me, cultural studies classes, history, obviously, and just a whole range, because, obviously, as long as you meet your requirements, this is really the only time that you can do that. I remember even in graduate school thinking, oh, I should take the class that I really like. And that's when you really buckle down and get sort of the core hard classes like stats and, econ and that sort of thing. But I think just really important to do that. Secondly, if you are interested in an international career, whether that's in diplomacy or human rights or international development, get experience in the communities that you want to work in. And by that, I mean on the ground, not in like a member of the office of a member of Congress, or like in that community. So whether that's going to, and Duke has a lot of these service learning types of activities, right? The Heart Leadership provides that, but I think there's other new opportunities now. But go into those communities where you're actually working directly with people. You will probably not be able to do much to change their trajectory in life, but what you'll do is learn a whole lot about yourself and the humility that comes with being an outsider that, to try to help a community. I think that's incredibly important. I went through the Refugee Action Project, which is something that the Heart Leadership program offered at the time, working in a Bosnian refugee camp. I showed up there thinking that I was going to do all this stuff to help refugees. I literally did nothing except maybe teach a couple of kids how to say hello and how are you in English. But what I did learn was that there is a whole lot of humility. There's power relations that you really do have to understand when you go into a place. And I think that really, it helps you as you go through life thinking that you want to do good and really trying to understand where you're coming from. The other thing is trying to get as much experience in other countries as you can if you really do want to work on the international side. A lot of places, including the UN, nonprofits, and humanitarian organizations don't hire anyone if you've never worked abroad before. They want to know that you're not going to show up in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, or whatever and crumble, right? That you Duke does provide some of that, whether that's study abroad or a summer internship or whatever. Just try to get that experience as much as possible, and I thought that was really helpful. Language skills, obviously, always very important, and then just the ability to just kind of be kind to people and, getting to know people. I know at some point some of us are very driven and we want results. We want it, but I think, and that's one thing I think I would have, I was so sort of hard driving and kind of wanting to achieve things, wanting to do things really ambitious. And I think just taking the time to understand that there are people who think differently than you, especially in this political environment right now, and just being able to listen and understand where they're coming from and why they have the views that they do. I think it'll serve you no matter where you are, and especially if you're working with people from other cultures.
Kiara, Tomas?
I would definitely second, if you want to work in international development or humanitarian, get to those countries, get some experience on the ground and see if that really is what you want to do. Because I know many people who've been in situations in the developing world and suddenly they realize that it really isn't for them. That's not really what they want to do. And maybe they want to do good in their own communities. That can be, equally rewarding. Another thing that I would definitely tell myself, everybody told me network. And nobody really told me how to do that. Nobody really made me do that, made me jump into that until later in my career. And as an undergrad, I think understanding that I can just go talk to people and I can ask questions, and it doesn't need to be this big dramatic thing. It doesn't need to be, hey, I need you to give me a job. It can just be more of a fact-finding mission. It can be a conversation. It can be a much lower stakes situation. I think that would have helped me, I don't know, maybe find a clearer path. It's always a winding road for everybody, but that was something that was a mystery for me for a while, and I think intimidating to me, and it really didn't need to be. So that would be, a big piece of advice I would give my younger self.
Yeah, I would, tailing off of that, I would say that you probably don't need to know as much about whatever it is you think you want to do as you probably think. And the honest answer, at least in the spaces that I've been in, is that whenever I've come into a job as a new person, everybody's assumed I didn't know anything anyway. Like, I mean, they assumed I was dumb, and and basically I kind of was, because I came out of law school and I'm like, oh, I have a law degree now. I'm like, I remember, I'll tell a story that sort of speaks to this, and it probably also speaks to what you were saying about sort of humility, right? I moved to Tucson, Arizona, having never been there. I never lived in the desert before. I was working with immigrant communities, and I owned one suit. And I was a lawyer, and I was going to go talk to my clients and give them information. And I showed up, in my suit, and it was 110 degrees outside. I was so sweaty, and I felt like there was something that was like kind of off afterwards. And I was talking to my boss, and and I said, I thought it went okay. I trust some people, and she said, well, you probably shouldn't wear the suit because they're going to think you're from the government. They're going to think that, you're actually not someone who's there to provide assistance, provide a service that actually speaks to their needs. And, for me, that sort of encapsulated this idea, one, that, you've got to meet people where you are. Two, that there is an intrinsic value, I think we've all said, about trying to understand the real world, real life implications of these things that that you all are sort of studying and sort of even working on in projects outside of the classroom. And third, again, this idea that I didn't know a damn thing, and that was okay. I think, if you feel like you are interested in a topic and a job, yes, it is great to have experience in that subject. But if you are also at a phase where it's like, well, it would have been better to have been interested 2 years ago, but I can't do anything about that now, you should still try to find your way in there, because it turns out, especially coming straight out of school, nobody expects you to know anything.
So I think that's all really fabulous advice. But when we're sitting, here, I think someone on the last panel said this. They talked about the highlight reel, right? So we hear about all these highlights, all these amazing things that all of you have accomplished. And I'd love to have Kiara start us off with this question, but can you think about a time, or a couple times maybe, where you faced a setback or you've gone for something and you haven't gotten it? What did you do, and how did you bounce back?
Sure. Yes, I think highlights reel is we definitely, at least when I was talking about my background, I told you my resume background. I didn't tell you about the times that I had to take a lifeguarding job to pay the bills while I was waiting for a security clearance. I didn't have to tell you about being home healthcare aide after college because I didn't know what the next step was. I hadn't figured that out yet. But there's also things I thought I wanted to be in the Foreign Service, and the Foreign Service test is a long, difficult test. I talked to people who had taken it, and everybody's like, you don't pass it on your first time, but try it, take it. And I, of course, was like, well, you didn't pass it on the first time, but yeah, I didn't pass it. I got through the first round, and I was like, this is great. I was not prepared for the setback of not making it the next round. And I didn't know what to do then. I had no backup plan. It was suddenly like, this is what I had planned to do. What do I do now? So that was one of the moments where I really was forced to go back to my network and figure out kind of what networking looks like. And so I went back to the people I'd worked with at the State Department. And I said, what do I do? How do I get the experience I need to pass this test? What would you guys recommend? I did basically the networking that I should have been doing all along, but this is just sort of what forced my hand. And people were like, well, what do you really want to do? And I said, I want to go somewhere in the world and just get those experiences. I want to not be sitting in an office right now trying to figure out my life. And so I said, well, you should join the Peace Corps. And they said that's a really great way that a lot of people that have gone on to join the Foreign Service or do this kind of work, that's a great entry point for you. And I would have never considered doing the Peace Corps. It was an opportunity that I knew existed, but I hadn't really thought about doing it. And it was an opportunity that I then took, And it changed the trajectory of my career, going into international development rather than more of the diplomacy route. And, I haven't really looked back. It was the sort of thing, though, that if I hadn't have had that setback in like the job that I knew I wanted, I would have never looked for wider and different opportunities. And so, yeah, I mean, I can't say I'm grateful for the setback necessarily, but I think in retrospect, I really am. I think I am much happier on this route.
I would, I graduated from law school in a really bad economy. It was the height of the Great Recession. There were not tons of public interest lawyering jobs around, but I actually did have, and this was a position of privilege. I had an offer from a white shoe law firm in New York, from a big fancy place that was like, come work here and make a lot of money. And I was like, I don't want to do that. And it was late in my third year of law school, I went and talked to one of my professors about this. I said, I really want to try to get a public interest job. It's really not working out well. I can't get anything. I'm not even getting, interviews, right? Nothing's clicking. And he said to me, Tomas, you're fudged, but he said a little differently than that. And he's like, go to a law firm. You'll get a good experience. It's valuable. And I said, I didn't like that answer. So I went to go talk to another professor. And, again, I laid this out and I said, look, I this thing, and I really this is the kind of stuff I want to do. And he said, well, you know what it is that you want to do. The question is whether or not you have the guts to do it. Again, he's a little more colorful language in terms of how he phrased it. But, what he reminded me of was ultimately, right? And everybody has to make this calculation for themselves, right? But I realized I was in a position of relative privilege because of loan repayment programs and, where I was going to school and all that kind of stuff, where I said, I can take a calculated risk. And I also realized, right? And basically what it reminded me was like, look, there are jobs out there. The question is, where are you willing to be? And, I thought, I haven't really done, like you said, the network work, right? Like the talking to people. And that's how I ended up in Arizona, never having set foot there. And none of what I've done happens without going to Arizona in the first place. None of that happens without, my professor just saying, you're screwed, buddy. Being able to, I really felt like being the position you're in, right? You've got all kinds of employers who are walking onto campus and saying, here's a job, apply for this job. Big consulting firms, tech companies, finance, you name it. They show up, you apply, and it makes it pretty easy. And what I would say, right, is that a lot of the jobs that I think we're talking about, right, they're jobs that you have to sort of go out and find, in part because, there isn't necessarily the money to hire thousands of people to sort of do this work. But that, using the resources, right, that exist in this room, in the university, in the school, these are things that can work in your favor. I'll also add that I failed the bar exam the first time I took it, so I'll throw that in. And that was, also not something that delighted me at the time. It was very public kind of failure because they post the names of everyone who passes, and so everybody sort of saw that my name wasn't there. That was not ideal. Yeah, I would say that not taking no for an answer is a valuable thing to do in the space.
I was sitting here listening to these stories, trying to think about which example I was going to use. Maybe just one is just straight to this non-traditional careers. Straight out of college, everybody starts to, last semester in school, everybody starts to winnow down to whether they're going to graduate school, medical school, law school, whatever. Or they're going to go to an investment bank and or a consulting company. You have all those consulting firms coming in through the door at career services and interviewing tons and tons of people. And I knew that I was not going to take any of those paths. But it also meant that I was jobless and I had no idea. And my mother said, this is what you get when you're a history major, right? But thank goodness I did not listen to that. And so to Thomas's point about, charting a path for yourself and not taking no for an answer. I then went to, my professors at Duke and said, I really want to try this non-traditional career path. And no, I'm not self-funded. No, my parents cannot, afford for me to have a free internship in, an unpaid internship in Washington. But I do want to do something. And I was able to work with him to create a fellowship through the Heart Leadership Program to bring me to Ethiopia. And that was, raised $25,000. He found me a mentor and an institution to tack on to, and I was able to do that. But it took me a while. It wasn't until July after graduation that I actually thought I might have something. Otherwise, I was there alone and adrift and having to find something else out there. But I think it also just giving yourself that space and just knowing that you are capable people who are, obviously you've gotten this far. You will find something. You are talented. There's a lot of room and space for good talent out there, and you will find a place for yourself. The second thing I'd say is just, after I left the United Nations, so I was in Kofi Annan's office. Really great. He was an amazing person to work for. I mean, I would love to tell stories about him. He passed away last year, which is really unfortunate, but he's wonderful. So after I left the UN, I thought, well, what do I was recruited to be chief of staff to a philanthropist who was going to be an envoy. And so I took that thinking, okay, I know about the UN. He didn't know anything, but maybe I'll help him out. But working for a billionaire philanthropist they have quirks. They're quirky people and they have a lot of money, and they think that that comes with a lot of power, and that whatever they decide is the right decision, which is not necessarily true. And so, I was working in a pretty toxic environment, and, I knew that pretty soon in. Whenever you are confronted with being in a work environment that is toxic, meaning your coworkers are out to get you, that you feel like everywhere you turn, you have to sort of look, be careful about knives that might be, out for you, or whatever it is, or you're not learning, if more than 20% of your time is spent on really unpleasant things or things that frustrate you, find a way to leave. I decided that a few months in, but I thought, you know what, I should probably stick around for a year just because I don't want it to look like it was on account of me that I left. Nowadays, I think you guys have a little bit of a shorter period of time. People seem to move around in jobs a lot more frequently. But for me, I thought it was a year. And literally on the year mark, I said, I'm going, and I found a different position. Of course, I laid the groundwork before that and, sort of confidentially looked for something else and was able to find something. But quitting when you know it's time to quit, just listen to your gut. If it doesn't feel right, do it. It doesn't mean you're a quitter. It doesn't mean that you haven't been able to succeed or, achieve something yet again. It just means that maybe if there's a lot of frustration, listen to yourself, understand what your strengths and weaknesses are. So this job, I realized being chief of staff, I'm really bad at being a chief of staff. I'm just not organized enough. I'm more of a big strategic thinker, more of a doer, and more of a kind of guiding other people and inspiring people and kind of building things, and not being the person to think nuts and bolts about every little, making the trains run on time and those types of things. But I think those kinds of experiences. So embrace failure, embrace, the sort of, if your gut is telling you something, it's okay to quit. Just make something of that.
Fabulous. So thinking of non-traditional career paths, Tomas, I'd like to start with you. Can you give some examples of either people or experiences that have led people to work in your line of work that maybe aren't what you'd think of right off the bat? So someone on the last panel mentioned that one of their former colleagues at a consulting firm was an MMA fighter, for example. I don't know if you have that. What does that mean? Mixed martial arts. Oh.
Yeah, like UFC, that kind of thing. Yeah. I don't have any. I don't currently, or I don't think I've previously worked with any MMA fighters, unfortunately. But one thing I'll put out there, right, is that I know that we've been speaking. I think rightfully right. The gospel is sort of not saying no, doing the things you want to do in terms of pursuing public interest work, but I know plenty of people who have gone into public interest work via the private sector, right? Especially, again, I come from sort of the law side, and it is true that from the law side, there are people who do have valuable experiences, outside of, directly altruistic work that end up winding their way into, a number of the places, that I've been. It's also true, right, that I've had people who thought they were going to do one thing and ended up doing something very, very different. Some of that is related to law, where I went to law school with people who are now novelists or TV writers, and and they say, make no mistake, my law degree did not help me get this job. And so I offer that to anybody who tells you, you can do anything with a law degree. Most of those things you can do with a law degree are things you can do without a law degree. But I think in terms of sort of the public interest space, I think, especially when it comes to working directly with people, what I see is, sort of bottom line, sort of a willingness to take a chance. Because I've encountered people who came into the work from being even a directly served community member, for example, who becomes an advocate for their own community. I think it is true that in at least the spaces I've been in, there are, sort of a lot of particularly set paths, right? Because you have to go to law school to be a lawyer. But in the wider space of nonprofit work, I mean, it's almost, many of the people I know kind of stumbled their way in. I mean, I work with people who are policy advocates and experts who were social workers, working, directly on individual cases. I have, worked with, I have a senior staff member who spent, over many years as a teacher, sort of in classrooms, and one day, sort of got the bug for organizing and actually got involved in 2008 with the Obama campaign. And that set forth sort of a whole set of things where now this person's an organizing strategist. And so you have to be open to the things that happen to you in your life, to actually see what you find interesting. I mean, the best advice I got on that front was that I had this really boring law partner tell me that I should do whatever I think is interesting. And that's what he'd always done. And I thought the things he'd done were like, it was like banking regulation. It was like incredibly dry, but he was right. And I think if you listen to that instinct, it tends to land you in a decent place.
Kara, I'm in too.
Sure. So I think, so I actually started at a software startup, and that tinged a lot of my international development work. I still work in science and technology programs. I was a computer science teacher when I was in the Peace Corps. And I think in specifically kind of working in the science and technology sides of international development, we're working on the digital strategy right now for USAID, how to use digital more. We bring in a lot of people who have never worked in international development before necessarily, but they are engineers. They are people who have, we're trying to bring in people who do solar, off-grid energy in America, and how to translate that to places that don't have any access to grids in, West Africa, that kind of thing. So I work with a lot of people who have been experts, have been, very advanced in other fields, that kind of got the bug to do something different. I mean, I worked with one guy who had been a microbiologist, and after getting his PhD in staring at petri dishes, he was like, I got the PhD in microbiology and never wanted to do microbiology ever again. So he went into science policy and using that as a diplomatic tool. We also, since it's the U.S. government, you get a lot of people on detail from universities and things. So I worked with like a bee expert who we kept trying to send to malaria conferences because we're like, mosquitoes can't be that different from bees. And he really did not feel that bees and mosquitoes were similar. But, so you end up working with a really wide variety of people, and it's exciting, it's fun, it's sometimes difficult because you have to translate. I find a lot of my job being translating between engineers and development professionals. But it's a fun group of people usually. Yeah.
So just immediately comes to mind two people. So I just, when I was in Kofi Annan's office, there was a speechwriter in his office who was just incredibly talented, and she could just turn around a speech in no time, and it was beautiful and just really great stuff. Turns out on the side, she is a romance novelist. And that's actually what she spends most of her time on. And she can, as I said, turn out a speech in no time flat. And it was curious because she would walk around and she really didn't care. I mean, this is a diplomatic setting where I wore a pantsuit every single day. Up until I think 10 years before I started at the UN, if you were a woman, you had to wear a skirt with hose inside the UN, didn't matter how hot or whatever it was. But she would always wear leather, a tutu, fishnet stockings, whatever it was. She did not care, but she was there, and 5-inch stilettos. But she was so good at it. It didn't really matter. But it went perfectly well with her romance novelist self. So, and I think that her ability to communicate was probably part and parcel of that. And then secondly, just on the Sustainable Development Goals, the last few years, one of our biggest advocates and who's really helped us, I think, enable you all to even know what the Sustainable Development Goals is a guy named Richard Curtis, who's a filmmaker. He just wrote this film yesterday about people forgetting that the Beatles existed. He also wrote like all the Bridget Jones movies, Four Weddings and a Funeral, Love Actually, anyway, on and on and on. All the like British rom-coms, right? He's the father of that. Oh, Mr. Bean, anyway. But he was, just an amazing guy, super down to earth, ran around in a backpack like he was a graduate student. But he helped to popularize the Sustainable Development Goals. We negotiated all this stuff, and I remember sitting down, he was like, sustainable what? And, he just couldn't, and he said, this is the global goals. We're going to find a way, we'll get some soccer players to do a dizzy goal challenge. We're going to find ways to make these goals famous. And that's literally what he did. He got Jennifer Lopez, Beyonce, you name all sorts of stars around the world to do a video, tons of videos now. Go to globalgoals.org and you'll find a bunch of them. It might be globalgoals.com. But anyway, really cool, making global goals super cool. And so you talk about like unconventional people who if you're going to make social change, you really need to get to people's hearts and minds. And so at some point you do need great communicators who know how to appeal to the fun side of the joy in all of us to make us want to do good in the world. So those are my 2 examples.
So I have one last question for you guys, but we're running a little behind, so I'm going to ask for it to be a lightning round real quick. And it might be a tough one because I'd like you guys to just briefly, in about a sentence or so, describe someone who's helped you in your kind of career, your professional goals, a mentor, essentially. Lightning round, starting with whoever's ready.
The same professor who told me I was effed was the same professor who then stepped up and helped me get in, was really instrumental to getting me in the place to sort of get that first job in Arizona. This is Steve Weiser at Yale.
Ooh, I would have to say I was supervised in an internship by a person who was probably 2 years older than me. And she was the person who kind of laid it out for me of like, oh, if you actually want to work in this, here's the next step you have to take. Like a person that was just one step above me, basically, of being like, here's what that step looks like. Because you're talking to people that are way up here that don't know what that next step for you really should be.
Yeah, I'm running through all of my mentors. Can't choose among them. So I'll just say, find a mentor. You can't just walk up to somebody and say, hey, will you be my mentor? But you'll find a kind of rapport with folks who you work with. And I'd say probably the most important criteria for deciding to take a job is who will you be working for or who will you be working with, because those are the people who will teach you how to be a good manager, how to be a good leader, which are different things, how to work and how to, and just how to do the job, but also who will be your sponsor. So who's going to speak up for you when a promotion comes up or an opportunity comes up who says, actually, you know what, this is a really interesting, you should do this, or to give you straight up advice and say, you didn't do so well here and here's why and here's what you should do next time. So find yourself mentors, because it's just a really, just a critical part of career advancement throughout your career, and keep in touch with them. I'm not so great with that, but when I do, it's really good.
Fabulous and quick advice. All right. Well, with that, thank you all so much for joining us for this last session. Let's give a big round of applause to our fabulous alumni. Thank you.